Welcome to the Naturalistic Driving Study and Roadway Information Database Integration Training Session. This is the third in a series of 4 webinars related to FHWA's Safety Training and Analysis Center, or STAC, which is located at the Turner Fairbanks Highway Research Center. The STAC is FHWA's primary implementation effort related to the Roadway Information Database and the SHARP 2 Naturalistic Driving Study. Today's session will focus on the integration of driver, vehicle, and roadway data within the RID and NDS data sets to address research questions. Miguel Perez from Virginia Tech will first talk about map matching in general and in applications within the NDS, followed by Zach Hans from C-Tree, who will talk in depth about integration of the NDS and RID data sets for research questions. Charles Fay, the SHARP 2 research manager from FHWA STAC, will participate in Q&A. The presentation today will last roughly 1 hour, and we've allowed a half an hour for questions and answer. If you have questions during the session, feel free to enter them into the chat pod located on the left of the screen, and we'll answer those questions along with others raised verbally during the Q&A session. Now I'd like to turn it over to Miguel Perez from Virginia Tech.
Thank you, Brett, and welcome to everyone. I'll start the hold on. Brett, is there a way to get the poll out of the way? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So I'll start today by talking about the SHARP 2 NDS, and more specifically we'll talk about the links and the map matching process as it pertains to that data set, and how the original GPS points were converted to links, and how those links and their traversals are represented currently within the data set. So after we go through this session, you should be able to list and define some basic map matching nomenclature, name the key elements of the map matching table, be able to find and extract information from the inside trip density maps, and you will also be able to list the summary roadway characteristics that are available on the inside website. To define map matching, so when we say map matching, we mean programmatically associating the GPS points, or the breadcrumbs, the GPS breadcrumbs, with the digital map links that represent the roadways that were being traveled at any particular point in the data set by one of our participants. There are multiple reasons why that process is relevant and important. 3 of those are listed here. First, keep in mind that, as we discussed in the last webinar about the Roadway Information Database, those digital maps have some descriptive attributes that can be useful in many lines of research. And Zach will talk more about what some of those are later on, and plus he'll provide some examples. It's also important because working with a complete list of GPS points can be cumbersome, and it's really not necessary for most applications. There are cases where you need that, perhaps a little more accuracy or precision, but in most cases working at the link level is sufficient. And finally, keep in mind that map matching translates those GPS points into a form that it's more easily or more readily associated with those descriptive attributes in digital maps. So in terms of an illustration, here is what that slide said. So we start at the top left-hand corner with the breadcrumbs for 34 million miles of travel, 1 million plus hours, and so that translates to about 3.7 billion GPS latitude and longitude pairs. And so that's a fair amount of data, as you'd expect. On the right-hand side on the top, you have 1.8 million links. So we have the map database, and again, the map has those links. They have endpoints or nodes that are also represented in there. What you end up with when you combine those 2 things is that, like that diagram down at the middle, on the middle of the slide on the bottom, you end up with about 300 million or so different link traversals that then go into what we call the linking table, or the map matching table. And so you've reduced the I guess, density or volume of the data by an order of magnitude just by performing this process, which allows us to do make queries a whole lot more efficient and effective. In addition, as we'll illustrate here in a minute, you also get rid of some of the error that is inherent in the GPS signal. To clarify what I mean by links, in case some people have not been exposed to that terminology before. So they're just segments in a map database. And so those roads or road segments in a digital map database, they're typically stored at some sort of entity that has a shape. And those entities, in this case, we refer to as links. And as I mentioned, that map matching process then snaps those GPS data into those links. And down at the bottom of the slides, you have 3 illustrations of different mapping databases and how they refer to links. SRI is there on the left. You have Nokia and Navtec on the middle, and then OpenStreetMap. The particulars are not important. What's important is to understand that this is not one-off database that or a concept that only applies to one database, but most of these mapping databases have some links or some similar concept embedded in them. To further illustrate what we're discussing, so what you have here is a map of a segment of road, and then you have, it's kind of hard to see, but then the numbers that kind of drift around that roadway are different GPS breadcrumbs that for a trip traversal that cross that particular segment of road. Let me see if I can get the pointer here. There we go. So here is the actual roadway covered in red. These circles at the beginning and the end are endpoints or nodes. The nodes connect those links. And then as you can see here, there's this incoming road, and there's 3 different roadways that go out of that node. And so these different points that are all around the road are one trip traversal. Now in this case, the GPS signal, for whatever reason, didn't happen to be of great quality, and so even though the traversal actually occurred over that segment of roadway, the GPS points drift a fair amount. So the map matching process would take the GPS points starting at this node and going all the way to the node on the left and snap them to that roadway. So even though there's a fair amount of separation here between this GPS point and the roadway, it'll actually snap to that segment of roadway. And so that corrects the error to some extent, but it also reduces the dimensionality of the database. As it says there on the bottom of the slide, you have 45 different GPS breadcrumbs that end up becoming one link, one start point, and one end point in terms of the time series data. And so because of that dimensionality reduction, it makes searches a whole lot easier. When we talk about the map matching table, consequently, it's a relatively simple table. So we have a file ID that identifies the trip that you're talking about within the Naturalistic Driving Study. You have a column that indicates the order in which a particular link was traversed within that trip, and that's just sequential. You have the link ID column that identifies the link that is being traversed at a particular point in time, and then you have the start and end times for that link. So the time at which that link began to be crossed during the trip and the time when that crossing ended. The final column is that vehicle to node distance, and that's sort of a diagnostic column, if you will. So what that column details is the minimum distance that a particular GPS breadcrumb was from a particular node. And so if I go back here, in this case, the distance for these for the points that are up here on the top right would be relatively small. Once it gets to this endpoint, though, there's a little more drift, and so there'll be a little more distance in that column. And so what that allows you to do is identify situations such as this where there is some drift, or situations where the map matching process did not perform very well. What you would see in those cases is an increasing vehicle to node distance as you get further into the trip. What that looks like is illustrated on this slide. So this is just an Excel representation, but it has the columns that I mentioned before. You have a file ID, you have a link order starting at 1 and increasing sequentially. You have that vehicle to node distance that is generally in miles, so you're going to see some pretty low numbers here generally, as long as the map matching process is performing adequately. You have the link ID that comes from the map database, and then you have in milliseconds, the timestamp when the link traversal started and when the link traversal ended. And so again, it takes that GPS data, all those points, and it condenses them into positions identified based on the links. So one question that we get a fair amount is how many people, how many trips traverse certain segments of roadways. So if you are a researcher interested in infrastructure research or looking at infrastructure features or anything that can be located within a road, you might have ideas or locations that are of particular interest to you. And so the question is, are there NDS trips that traverse those locations? So to help with that question, we've provided within the Insight website that we talked about in a previous webinar. So there are trip density maps that allow you to look at the roadways and identify the number of trips and participants that traversed that location over the study period. If you are on Insight, you can go look under the Data tab, then pick the Trips box, and then the page that shows up, if you scroll all the way to the bottom of the page, you'll see the different travel density maps. There are 6 of them, 1 for each site. When you click on those, you'll get a map, a zoomed out map, kind of like similar to what's on the right-hand side of the slide. And it'll have a legend in there that indicates the number of trips on each of those links. It provides zooming capabilities, so you can zoom in to a particular stretch of road or a particular intersection. And then once you're zoomed in, you can actually click on the road that you're interested in, and that'll give you a box that provides the link ID for that route or route segment, as well as the number of traversals that were collected during the study period over that location, and the number of different participants that those traversals came from. So it could be that one location may have 10,000 trips, but they only came from 5 different participants, and that may not give you enough variety for what you're trying to do. So that's why the number of participants is also important. Keep in mind that the I guess background or the data that are used to drive these trip density maps can be obtained as an add-on to the RID with a data use license. Because it is based on human subject data, we still require for you to have a data use license to obtain it, but once you do, there's no cost to provide it to you. You just have to go through the process to get a data use license executed. And then at that point, you can put that information in the RID and do selections based on the trip densities directly on the RID. This illustrates the process to zoom into a particular link. I know you can't read the details of the box itself, but in this case, I've zoomed into a section of North Carolina and clicked on this roadway segment right here, and then this box here on the top will have the link ID that that corresponds to that segment of road. It will have the total number of trips that came from that segment, and then the total number of participants that those trips came from. And I'm sorry, yes, and the road name is what that first column right there, if it has a name attached in the map database. So related to Insight, a little more information in terms of roadway characteristics. So in addition to having the trip density maps on Insight, there's also some summary roadway characteristics available. There's no raw location information within Insight because it's a relatively public-facing website, but there has been some work done to I guess, transform those locations into attributes that can be useful for research. So if you go to the trip summary table on Insight, you start on data, go to trips, and then take the trip summary table. There are different variables that were derived from the RID and the map matching table. So once we had those, the map matching table completed, and Omar and his staff at C3 provided some link level information that was used to enrich the trip summary. That includes the percent of mobile van coverage for the trip. So as part of the RID, that main data layer is that what came from the mobile van. So that allows you to zone in or select trips that if you really care about some of the data elements that were collected by the mobile data by the mobile van, then you can pick trips that are going to have a lot of that information that will, because they drove on a lot of those routes. There's also estimates for the percentage of state data that coverage for a particular trip, and the percentage of HSIS coverage for each of the trips. In addition, there's a distribution for each of the trips of different roadway types that were traversed, and this is taken from HSIS, I believe. And so, for example, the percentage of the trip that traversed urban freeways or two-lane rural roads or other types of the HSIS classifications. And finally, there's also a set of variables that describe the percentage of the trip that was driven at various speed limit ranges. So from on areas that had a 25 to 35 mile an hour limit, on areas that had a 35 to 45 mile an hour limit, and so on. And so if you're looking for trips that have some freeway driving in them, for example, you can use the roadway types, look at that freeway variable, and maybe look for a high percentage of the trip that was traversed or that traversed those roadways. Or you could also look at the speed limit ranges and maybe look for a high percentage of the trips spent at the higher speed limit ranges or the higher speed limit regions. So as that final bullet says, those variables can be very useful in isolating trips that are of potential interest for particular research questions. And the key there is that you can come to us with those types of filters, and it's relatively easy to, again, isolate potential segments, or to some extent you can do it yourself within the Insight website. A couple of closing thoughts on in terms of map matching before I hand it over to Zach. So keep in mind that map matching is not a perfect process. We've looked at it a fair amount, and in general it correctly assigns the driving data to the correct length about 90% or so of the time. Trip starts and ends can be prone to error, particularly because the GPS, during the start of the trip, the GPS drifts a little bit while satellites are acquired and so on. And also when there's cases where a trip terminates abruptly, let's say there's a severe crash, or the data acquisition system crash, or things like that, that can lead to some error in those situations. Keep in mind that about 2% of the trips that we had could not be processed through the map matching process for a number of reasons. No GPS is one of them, and so on. And there are some known problem areas. So one of them is cutting a corner, like it's illustrated there on the diagram on the slide. So you have an endpoint down here at the bottom, another one at the top, and one to the right. And so these black points would be the GPS breadcrumbs. And so given a set of those GPS breadcrumbs, sometimes the map matching process might, instead of going up to the top endpoint and then cataloging or noting a right turn, it would actually get this side road here and I guess snap those points to that side road over there. So that's a known area of concern, particularly when there's some GPS drift. It's also susceptible to error when there's some doubling back, so a participant drives down a route and then right away maybe does a U-turn and comes back. And the final area is cases where there's parallel roads and there's a sizable GPS drift that can be problematic as well. Keep in mind that the fact that there is a link, it does not ensure that there's corresponding detailed roadway data. So as was referenced in the last webinar, not all the links in each of the sites could be cataloged or driven by the mobile van. So that's something to look for in the RID, see if there's a particular link has that kind of data. And related again to data selection, keep in mind that link traversals can be seen as events, if you will. So they have a file that belongs to them and then a start point and an end point. And so that means that we can compute some summary measures, and in some cases you can filter by those. That filtering can be easier or harder depending on what kind of measure you're looking for, but let's say you wanted to look at link traversal times, so you wanted to look at a particular point at a particular location, and you were only interested in relatively free flow traffic over that location. One thing we can do relatively easily is identify the trips that traverse that link, look at the traversal times, how long it took for a driver to traverse that link, and then look at distributions for those, and then you can kind of pick where you want to be. You know, you only want trips that are on the 5th percentile and below, or maybe on the 95th percentile and above of that traversal time. So that's an option. You can do things with speed and other variables too. Those are a little harder, but anything with time is relatively straightforward as well. And finally, if you are interested in additional information, keep in mind that there was an Insight webinar on map matching a few months ago, and the link to that webinar is there on the page. If you navigate to Insight to the background section too, you can go and you'll see that webinar listed. And if you have more questions about the detailed process for map matching, there was a report generated for that, and that's published on the TRB website at that link listed in the slide. And with that, we'll save questions till the end, but thank you for your attention, and I'll pass the ball, I guess, to Zach.
Thank you very much. What we're going to do today is kind of we'll cover some of the material that Miguel talked about as well, so there'll be some overlap. I do have Omar Smati and Skylar Knickerbocker as well. We're working on the project from the RID perspective, and they may interject as we discuss the linking process from the RID perspective, as well as we'll go through a couple examples about how you can pull data beginning at the NDS and go to the RID and vice versa. So just kind of to kick off some of the things that we're going to go over today and kind of the main points to learn, as Miguel touched on, this links serve as a fundamental means to relate and integrate the NDS and RID data. Both NDS and RID contain and possess link components. They are derived, the trips, as Miguel said, have links derived and assigned to them. If you're working with the data, either from an RID or NDS perspective, data can be requested using those links. Any of the link data can be integrated with any of the RID data through linear referencing system that's provided. or less precisely through use of spatial proximity analysis. And from a research perspective, the length, trip count, and participant counts that have been developed by VTTI are very useful in being able to assess a research question, whether you're interested in drivers of certain characteristics or trips of certain characteristics or trips on certain types of roadways, to be able to assess whether you have enough participants or trips to be able to successfully do the analysis that you want to. So this slide really just conveys that you can begin from the vehicle or driver side, identify the trips you're interested in, the drivers you're interested in, go through the link level to the RID, and then identify any of the roadway information of interest, or you can start at the link level or the RID level, and then in turn pull out any of the NDS trips or participants that you're interested in based on the types of roadways you're looking at. So if you're interested in horizontal curves of certain radius values or locations that have rumble strips or presence of shoulders, etc., you'll be able to use that information to identify locations that you would be interested in NDS trips. We didn't, in previous webinars, we've discussed what the RID, specifically the linear referencing system related to the RID, looks like. This is a quick overview slide kind of covering how the RID was developed. So through an Esri Navtech GIS database, we had consisted of links throughout the network. The first figure conveys basically the beginning and ending points of all those links in the network. These links had a road name and some general characteristics, but they did not possess any information regarding a route and measure that we need in the LRS. So from that then, we developed a consistent, we have now all of these links along the route. Now we have an individual route, a unique route ID assigned to it, and a from and to measure for that route. That information then is used, any information from the mobile data, any of the state information that we obtained were conflated to these routes. So then, in this example, we have lane data that was mobilely collected. We know the route it was on and the from and to measure. So you can see the segmentation here is a bit shorter in many cases than the links themselves, simply because of changes in the lane network. From that as well, conflating back the link data to the routes, now we know on the link, we know the route it's on and the from and to measure. So on every given link, we can integrate with any other RID data through the linear referencing system, through the route name and the from and to measure. So these arrows simply convey that once we started with the original links, we can go back and forth between the routes and any of the mobile or any of the other RID data, the links and any of the other RID data, and then obviously the links back to the linear referencing system itself. This is an example that Miguel had presented, these trip count maps. This is just another example of a way to present it. We were presenting it in this location based on trip counts based on mileage quintile, so we broke the mileage down into 20% of the mileage within the state, and then presented a heat map in a little different manner. And we can see that the trips, and, as Miguel said, the trips and participant counts exist on all the links within the network, and the corresponding links are assigned. So you can kind of see those areas that have the higher density, which you would expect given the fact that where the core area of the participants were located, but you can also see throughout the state you have quite a few trips that traverse quite a distance within the state. This is another example of how this information can be presented. It's a proportional map showing the trip counts and the counts of participants. So the thick red lines represent the number of trips, and then the orange lines or yellow lines superimposed represent the participant count. So that you can see some locations where you have high trip counts as well as high participant counts, but then other locations where you may have higher trip counts but fewer participants. So it's just a visualization mechanism that you can kind of identify where you're having trips and participants, and depending on what your perspective is and the interest is. Now, from a roadway characteristics perspective, you can also identify which locations you might be interested in obtaining the NDS data. In this example, we were looking at identifying locations that have high volume intersections that have bike lanes, In this case, this was an intersection that has our intersections with AADT, or traffic volume, of over 50,000 vehicles a day, and a corresponding bike lane. This information, knowing these locations through use of dynamic segmentation or spatial selection, these locations can be, all the links located at that general proximity can be fed back to VTTI, and the NDS data for those locations can be identified and provided back to the researcher. As Miguel talked about, trip summary files are available on the Insight website. Kind of a general overview of how that was developed, it was really an early integration of the links data and the roadway data. The link level attributes were derived from various sources. The general road class information, which is consistent with the Highway Safety Information System road class system, were derived using two different methods: through the underlying Esri NAVTEC dataset, which is comprehensive throughout the entire network, as well as any state data that we may have had. Now, the state data varied from state to state. So with respect to the extent and data provided, or the attributes provided. So we may have more detailed information, but it may not have been extensive. And each state required some different procedures to be able to derive the road classes. Speed limit information was derived initially through use of the mobile data and presence of a speed limit sign on a link, as well as any state data that we may have had that provided speed limits. Now, since then, we have developed a reduced speed limit data set that integrates basically all the different sources of speed limit data that are available, whether it be the HPMS, the mobile data, any state data, any of the Esri NAVTEC data, and we have now developed a continuous longitudinal network that has all that information provided and integrated. So please keep in mind, with the speed limit data was kind of an initial effort that we were using to summarize the trips. Mobile data presence, Miguel touched on. Basically, this indicates if a link has mobile data present or not as part of the approximately 25,000 centerline miles that were collected. I believe that there were have been found approximately 70% of the trips have mobile data present, so that's a very good percentage. And also we have these, we integrated the state data presence as well. Again, different states provided different levels of data, complexity of data, but any given link, we know whether we have any data present from the state that has been provided by the state. That might be a limited set, or it might be a pretty comprehensive set, depending on what information that the state had available to provide. This is an example of a road class, derived road class map from the Esri and NAVTEC data. And as you can see, because we have the information available throughout the entire network, you have a very good distribution of the derived types. These types are derived based on urban and rural classifications. It's kind of hard to see here, but this will provide some information on the types of roadways that those NDS participants were driving on. This, if we were looking at the state data only, this would be a reduced map, because in this state example of Washington, they only provided data on the state-maintained roadways. Using the Esri NAVTEC data, any road within the study area or within our network was provided, and a road class derived. Now what we'd like to do is go through a couple examples of using trip data to identify roadway characteristics, as well as providing roadway characteristics to look at trip data. We'll begin with some of what we're known, what our exercise objective is. We'll go through an example using GIS. The RID is GIS-based. There's other mechanisms to do this, but given the nature of the RID, we'll go through it using some GIS functionality, and we can take some questions at the end if there are any other ways this may be accomplished. So our first example, we're interested, what we have known are the NDS drivers or trips of interest. Our objective is to identify roadway information for those trips. Data requirements would be the NDS data from VTTI. Specifically, we're going to be looking at an example map matching table that Miguel presented earlier. This map matching table that we're working with came from the Insight training data set, which is for North Carolina. And then the RID data, any RID attribute data that's available could be utilized. In this example, we're going to be looking at that reduced speed limit data set that we developed. So we have a few basic steps that we're going to be looking at through this process. Again, identifying roadway characteristics from the trip data. we're going to obtain that map matching file from VTTI, integrate the map matching file with the link data that we have within the RID, look at the speed limit data, integrate the map matching data and the speed limit data that we have, and then evaluate the final data and the output of the data set. In this example, the first step was obtaining the map matching file. There's multiple ways to get the map matching file. This is simply an example data set directly off the Insight data website. We have downloaded that data set. The contents, which Miguel has talked about before, we have a file ID, which represents a trip. We have the link order. We have the link ID, and we have the from and to time entered and time left that link. This can be filtered by the types of trips that we're interested in. So in this case, we're filtering it based on the individual trips, so we filter it to about 6 different trips.
So here in this case, we're showing just an example of what that map matching table looks like. For researchers who have already requested data from VTTI, they will get basically, depending on their data request, they will have a table that says, you know, here are your trips and here are your link IDs for whatever data requirements they have. The good thing about this whole process is the format of these data tables are the same. So whatever Zach is showing you this afternoon is basically the data that you will also get from VTTI in terms of your data request. So the process is the same, even though we're just working with the test data set at this point.
So if we go back, once we have that information, we've isolated the trips that we're interested in. And again, as Omar said, you might already have the trips that you want explicitly, but in this example, we've isolated the trips that we're interested in. We can save that as a CSV file or comma delimited file for future use within ArcGIS. Now, beginning working within ArcGIS, we simply open up a map, we import the trip CSV file that we created, and then we're adding speed limit data, and we're adding the links data to within our ArcMap document. Since the map matching file has each link explicitly indicated, that link corresponds directly to the links that exist within the RID, so we can directly do a attribute join between the links and the map matching file. The links has the route ID, the from and to measure. The map matching file simply has the unique route ID that's provided. So this is a simple, straightforward join based on attributes. As part of the process, to be able to identify which links that we want, we will do an export for use in dynamic segmentation. Dynamic segmentation allows you to integrate data that has comma and route names and from and to measures. You can do it using several different techniques. We're going to be using an intersection. So of those files that we want, we're going to export out the map matching file simply to a new data set. We'll open the speed limit data set that we have. This represents basically speed limit throughout the network. We'll also export that for use in dynamic segmentation. That table needs to be exported simply due to some requirements within the software. We could overlay route events within the basically the dynamic segmentation process requires an overlay of route events. Now we have the links of route events as well as the speed limit data set are both route events because we know the routes that they're on and the from and to measures of each of those data. This slide presents how those data sets are integrated. Basically, we identify the map matching data is an input data set. We identify the name of the file that we want, the tabular data, the route identifier field, and the from and to measure fields. And we also then use the overlay of the speed limit data set that we've exported. We're using an intersect to be able to, which will then ultimately return any results where both the speed limit data and map matching data, link data both exist. The output of this data, of the overlay process, is a new file in which the speed limits, the speed zones traversed by each driver or for each trip are revealed. So in this example, we can see we have Now a link order, we have that link ID, we have a speed limit, and we have a source of that speed limit data. This resulted in 948 total records based on the trips that we identified in our initial process in limiting the map matching file. We'll go on and we'll talk about some of the importance of knowing the speed limit and the source data in evaluating the data that you have through this process. So when we look at the results, we can see this is an example trip that is traversing, it's an eastbound trip. We have various sources of speed limit data along this trip. We have data from HPMS, we have data from the state. The yellow routes represent those of a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit. The blue routes represent those that are indicated as a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit. You can see here that we only have one speed sign for the mobile data. That's the information that we're most confident in. Now, while we had speed limit information collected on this entire route, we don't have any speed signs in any other location to indicate that there was a speed transition at this location from the state data from a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit to a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit. So as you're reviewing the data that you've obtained, keep in mind that the underlying data, given the fact that we have different sources, you have to have some discretion in the way you interpret the data. And we have an example below of actually where that speed limit sign is. This is from the RID view, which are available to all users of the RID, the images that were collected at the time that the mobile data were collected, and you can see that we have this 45-mile-an-hour speed limit sign that corresponds to that eastbound direction of travel.
So what Zach is discussing here is, even though we have the data, the confidence or the accuracy of the data depends on the source of the information or where we got that data. So the mobile data that we collected went through a QA process. We know it's 95% accuracy level. The state data or the HPMS data, we really don't have a good idea of how accurate that information is. So in this example, and the reason we wanted to show you this example, no, it's 95% accuracy level. The state data or the HPMS data, we really don't have a good idea of how accurate that information is. So in this example, and the reason we wanted to show you this example is, we do have two different speed limits, one from the state and one from mobile data. But we don't have any information from the mobile data whether that speed transition happened or not. That's where you, as a researcher or working with the data, have to develop this comfort level in terms of how to use the information and the type of information you want to use, and how does that impact your selection of data to proceed with in answering your questions. So in this case, if you didn't have a lot of segments selected or a lot of trips selected, you might take both of them. In other cases, you might say, okay, I want to stick only with the mobile data because I have confirmation that that speed limit is 45 or 35 or so on. So again, we can integrate the data, but at the end of the day, it's up to your discretion in terms of answering your research question, which data sets you would use or which segments or which trips would end up in your models for doing further research.
Now, from the next example or demonstration that we're going to go through is really related to taking roadway information and then identifying those corresponding trips. So the objective is to identify trip counts for locations satisfying that exist in the state of New York, that occurred in 2012, and that have work zones that lasted longer than 7 days. So again, we're using not necessarily RID data, but we're using some supplemental data that were included as part of the RID that were provided by the states, this work zone data. So it shows you the ability to not simply use roadway characteristics, but now we're using roadway information that were obtained from the state and are really somewhat different in nature, but yet have some spatial components so that we do know where these work zones were occurring. So the basic steps through this demonstration are identify our data needs, add the data ArcMap, select the 511 data or the work zone data of interest, select the corresponding links related to that 511 data for requesting the NDS data, exporting the links for the requesting process, and then display the trip counts for the NDS.
So, and on those steps that Zach is mentioning, identifying the data needs is probably one of the most important, and understanding what data we have both in the RID and NDS is very critical. The NDS side is kind of very consistent because they had the same sensors, same data, if it existed or not, the same structure of the information for every trip. From the RID side, if it was mobile data, then we had it we had all those data elements for those data attributes, for those segments that we collected data on. If it was state data, then we had, as Zach mentioned, we have different attributes coming from the states depending on how comprehensive their data set was. So part of this process is understanding what data exists and what data elements you can work with. For a first user of the RID, this might sound like a daunting task. The more you work with it, the easier it becomes. But we also work and serve as a resource. So if you have questions in terms of what exists or what doesn't exist, we can definitely work with you, and we can help you explore that data set and try to answer the questions that you have in mind. Also, most of the stuff that Zach is showing requires somebody to have GIS experience, understanding how to work with ArcMap, which is an Esri product. Again, that's not the only way to access the data. You can work with us, and we can, talk about how much time and how much resources it will take. If you have a set of trips or a set of roadway characteristics that you're starting with, we can definitely work with you to produce a summary file that you can work with VTTI directly, or if you have the number of trips, we can give you the roadway characteristics directly. So there are multiple ways in terms of working with the RID, including working with it on your own, asking questions from us and working with it on your own, or ultimately coming back to us and saying, I need help producing a data set for the research questions that I have. And all of these are feasible and valid approaches to working with the RID.
Thank you, Omar. So that first kind of important step that Omar was talking about was identifying data needs. So if you're interested in work zone data, and whether in a state of interest that exists, that we provide in the RID summary files that will indicate all the data that are provided. Looking at the summary files for New York, we see that in the supplemental data set we have 511 events. We have 511 events by year. We indicate what kind of type it is. In this case, it's a point type. There's also data that's available regarding construction and work zone activities, but are limited to that Buffalo area. So if we have statewide data we're interested in, we can use the 511 data set. If we have, if we're interested only in the Buffalo area, the core area of the participants, we can use this other data set that's limited to that area. So the data requirements, again, would be the 511 data from the supplemental data set statewide. The links, obviously, because the links will be the core element in which we'll go back and request the NDS data. And as I noted, the alternate data set would be the data for the Buffalo area only. So within ArcGIS, again, we open up the 511 data, which has all been conflated to the network. We'll add their point coverage. We'll add the links and the routes as well to the network. In this map, you can see all the points represented by the 511 events. We have the links, and we also have the underlying routes. The underlying routes are necessary to be able to form some dynamic segmentation. We'll select the work zones based on event type, and there's a lot of words on the slide that I won't get into, but really the core elements here are to note that there's some inconsistencies in the way in which the events in the 511 data set are coded. So if we look for unique values within the 511 data set, we can see that construction and work zone are spelled different ways, with spaces, without spaces, uppercase, lowercase. So being able to identify what types of attributes you really want to select, or which types of events you really want to select, requires looking into the data a bit more to see that you might say you'd always call work zone uppercase with the space between the two, work and zone. That's not necessarily the case. So you have some GIS functionality to query out using some wildcards to be able to query out anything that might have the word construction. To query out, to make sure that you're only querying out, your queries are not case sensitive, for example. So this simply identifies the ability to identify any of those work zone or construction events that we might be interested in that might be coded as different event types. The next step would then be to refine that by limit, now that we've identified the work zone and construction events, to limit that to the duration. Earlier I said that we were interested in a duration of over 7 days. We can look at a close time of the event and the being different than the date that the event was created. That's again part of what's necessary in looking into the metadata to see what exists on each one of the data sets. But we can look at that and identify, simply perform a query to identify only those events where the close time is more than 7 days in advance or past the create time. Through use of those queries, a combination of identifying work zones and construction events of interest and then refining it by those of a duration of over 7 days, we end up with about 5,300 events selected within the data set. Now, what we'll do is we can identify all the links within 500 feet of the selected work zones. Now, 500 feet is simply an arbitrary number that was selected in this case. You can use a larger proximity, you could use a smaller proximity if you want to. We're simply identifying links that are near to those areas that the work zones existed. So several of the considerations, again, kind of related back to Omar was talking about with respect to understanding the data. These work zones are not provided as linear events. In some cases, work zones may, in fact, be a point event, bridge construction, for example, or a very limited linear event. But in other cases, the work zone might be several miles long, but might still be represented as a point event. So how do you deal with that in selecting the data of interest? When you do a spatial proximity selection, links that are going to be nearby to that work zone, even if it's not along the route of interest, may also be selected. Now, if we wanted to limit that possibility, you could simply perform dynamic segmentation between those work zones, which will have a route associated with them, and the location, or a measure at which it's located, with the link layer, which also has a route and a from and to measure. This will eliminate any links on proximate roadways. The challenge, though, is how to identify how you want to work with any links that might be upstream and downstream of those work zone locations. So through selecting all links basically within a 500 feet proximity of the work zones, we identified roughly 14,000 links of interest or possible interest. We can export those out now to provide to VTTIs to be able to request any NDS data for those trips. Now these could be refined by further looking at the active period. So we're interested in 2012. So you may not want any trips that were outside of 2012. Or you could specify, further refine it to when we know the begin and end dates of those construction activities, you could further refine it to apply temporal constraints. So we only want trips that occurred on those links within a given time period or a very specific time period. That refines the data requested to something maybe more manageable, and then identifies really what your core interest is, because there's really no interest, there's no need to identify trips at that same location in another analysis or another year, unless you wanted to frame a reference for how drivers traverse that location when the construction wasn't present. So upon making a request, giving those link IDs to VTTI, information can be provided back. This is simply an example of looking at the file that would have trip and participant counts. As Miguel said, that exists comprehensively throughout the data set. We can open that trip count file within ArcGIS. Again, join that directly using that link ID back to the link ID of the link data set. And then investigate the trip counts on each link that were near a work zone, looking at the trip frequency, the number of participants at those locations. And as we look at the data set, we can see this is kind of a heat map, as Miguel had talked about, looking at how many trips traverse those work zones or those roadways proximate to those work zones. As you look at this, you can see some of those proximate roadways that were selected. So you're dealing with links. You've returned links in the selection that are probably not along the work zone. But we also know that the work zone may extend beyond simply the links that we identified. This is an example of looking at a specific location and accessing and understanding the data. Sometimes this requires you to go back in and do another request and kind of refine the way you're working with the data. So this is a location, a single point location in the data set that has 12 events, 12 work zone events coded at the same exact location. Each work zone event has a varying duration, a begin and end time. It's also coded to both directions. It's reported as occurring in both directions of travel. It's essentially bridge work in both directions of travel. However, if you look at it, you can see that the point is only coded to one direction of travel, the southbound, eastbound direction of travel. So if we were using dynamic segmentation in this case, you would be missing any kind of trips that were located on that opposite direction of travel because the routes were identified as only occurring in one direction. Now, so this is a case where that spatial proximity-based selection may have been more appropriate to be able to capture any links that may have been identified. So using that 500 feet, we'd be able to identify those parallel roadway as well. At this location, we had a total of 96 trips and 46 participants over the entire NDS analysis period. That does not necessarily mean 96 trips and 46 participants during the time the work zone was active. Furthermore, since we have data collected, front right-of-way imagery collected as part of the data collection of the mobile data, oftentimes in any of the mobile attributes, there will be a comments field that will indicate whether construction is present or a work zone is present. So you can further look to see, can I identify from my data set what actually that type of work zone was, other than just the description provided by the state. In this case, we're looking at the lane data and did a query of looking at any location or any record that indicated that there was a construction activity in the comments. Doing so, we can see that we actually had at our work zone of interest, or one of our work zones of interest, you can kind of see what that work zone looked like at a given period of time. We can see that transition into the work zone as it enters the bridge, and you can see some of the work activity during the bridge. Again, this is a snapshot in time, but it does still reveal the ability to maybe use the RID and the richness of the RID to identify, if you're interested in work zones, for example, the types of activities that may have been present. Now, this is not going to exist in all cases because there will not be images of every work zone, but you will have the ability to maybe select some of those locations, given the fact that the RID does have those images in which the mobile data were collected. So as kind of to wrap up, we just wanted to hit on our our initial points again, is the fact that the links serve as a fundamental means to relate and integrate the NDS and RID. Both NDS and RID possess link components. All the NDS trips understand what the corresponding links are based on Miguel's discussion. You may be able to request both NDS and RID data using the links. As Omar said, if you have some questions, need some help at refining the data in the RID, links would be a way to be able to potentially do that if you're beginning from the NDS standpoint. Links can be integrated with all the data that exists in the RID that have from a route and a from and to measure. Also using spatial proximity as our last example provided. Sometimes spatial proximity might provide more benefit than actually doing a more robust integration through use of dynamic segmentation. And then lastly, those trip counts and the participant counts are very valuable, whether at a very high level or for a refined time period, to be identified. Is the research question that you want to ask, is it feasible to support that given what the NDS participants were doing at those given locations of interest? This is the contact information for Omar, myself, and Skylar. Feel free to send us contact us with any questions you may have beyond the webinar as well.
And just to kind of follow up with what Zach is talking about, is we're also producing, he talked about the speed limit reduced data set as part of our support for Charles and the STAC. We're producing 4 other reduced data sets, one to give coverage in terms of number of lanes, one to give coverage for intersections, one is for curves, and what's the last one, Skylar? Divided roadways. So those reduced data sets would help researchers that don't have a lot of experience with GIS to kind of hit the ground running because those data sets already exist. We also developed a dynamic segmentation tool that basically provides the ability to novice users or even medium, moderate level users of GIS who have not been involved with location referencing and dynamic segmentation to basically do that process outside the GIS environment. You still have to have the software, you still have to have the license for Esri, but this allows you to do simple selections in a simple graphic user interface to do one type of dynamic segmentation, which is intersection of multiple data sets. I think we allow you up to 10 different data sets, and that makes it a little bit easier to produce a list of segments or locations of interest so that it can facilitate that further linking and integration with the NDS, and also to make sure that your research questions are feasible in terms of approaching it, at least from the roadway side. So there, in the next couple of months, there'll be a little bit more information in terms of what we're producing in terms of reduced data sets and some of the tools. The tool itself will have a user manual that allows folks to basically follow the simple steps in terms of using the dynamic segmentation tool. Charles, anything you want to add on terms of the STAC before we open the floor for discussion and questions?
No, thanks so much. I think we can go directly to questions.
Okay, thanks, Zach, Omar, and Miguel. Eric, would you give us some directions for Q&A, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to ask a question, please press star 1 on your telephone. A voice prompt on your phone line will indicate when your line has been opened. You may remove yourself from the queue at any time by pressing the star key followed by the digit 2. If you're using a speakerphone, please make sure your handset is picked up before pressing the corresponding digits. Again, please press star 1 at this time.
Okay, star 1 to raise your hand and get verbal and ask your question. You can also enter them into the chat pod there. We prefer them verbally, but if you have questions, either will work.
While we're waiting for some questions, I'll ask a question maybe for some clarity in case folks who tuned in either weren't familiar with the RID and our coverage. But Zach or Omar, could you sort of describe what you mean by network coverage for the Esri data and for the mobile data, the state data?
Yes. So the RID contains, as Zach explained, data from multiple sources. So the first source that we look at is the mobile data, where we've hired a contractor to go out and collect specific roadway attributes that included geometry, included signs, guardrails, number of lanes, curvature, and so on. Those were completed for 12,500 center line miles approximately. There were, a range of between 3,000 to 4,000 miles in each one of the study sites in terms of data collection. That data went through a quality assurance process to ensure that we meet minimum accuracy requirements. So when Zach talked about 70% of the trips, there are 70% of the NDS trips that have mobile data associated with them, which is the highest accuracy data, the most detailed information in terms of roadway characteristics. Our second source of data came from the state DOTs. So we captured roadway information from the 6 state DOTs. That roadway information is variable based on what the DOT maintains and what they were able to provide to us. For example, the state of Washington, we got a lot of roadway characteristics from the state of Washington. They have a sign database, they had curvature data set, but again, the number of miles that the state DOT owns compared to the total number of miles in Washington is limited. So the state coverage only applies to the state DOT data. In contracts, for example, we can go to North Carolina, and the state DOT in North Carolina manages almost the entirety of the highway system in the state, except within urban areas. So the number of miles that came from North Carolina was massive compared to other state DOTs. Our estimate of the state provided data is about 200,000 miles. So 200,000 miles of state provided data is our second source. The third source is basic information that we receive from ESRI and NAVTEC in terms of link data. So every link we provided minimal data that included ZAC direction, functional classification. It's different than what we're used to in terms of functional classification, whether that segment is one-way or two-way, speed if it's available, and lanes if it's available. So that coverage basically does not include every road in the study site, which is a small portion of the state, the major functional classifications in that entire 6 study sites, and then roads that we considered critical within the 48 states, contiguous states in the country. We excluded major urban areas like City of New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, but there is a lot of coverage outside the 6 study sites. It doesn't have a lot of data associated with it, but it does have limited data, but still allows the researchers to link that data and work with the NDS data because we have that coverage. So 12,500 Central Line miles with a lot of data, about 200,000 miles with some data, but it's different from one state to another, and then probably a good 2 million miles or maybe 1.5 million miles of data outside the 6 states with very limited information.
Thank you.
And there are no questions in the queue at this time. Once again, it's star 1.
Maybe while we're waiting, I'll pose a question to Miguel. I don't know if there's an answer for this, Miguel, but so you had indicated occasionally when the map matching doesn't work out, in which case, so the map matching is an automated process. So in which case, what do you resort to a manual review of the forward video? How do you go about resolving that issue using the example that you had shown where the car was sort of cutting a corner?
Right. It's a case-by-case, I guess, approach. We've had situations where, yeah, we'll look at the forward video. You'll look for landmarks and things like that. We'll use that vehicle to node distance as well to sort of serve as a diagnostic. So you'll see the process. You'll see that distance be reliably low for some of the trip, and then all of a sudden it'll ramp up. So generally, when you see that, then that tends to indicate there was some missed turn or something on the route, and so at that point you can kind of go back to a point where that vehicle to node distance was small, and then kind of work your way up from there. For things like crashes, though, one thing we've done is sort of go in and verify. So we'll start with the result of the map matching process, and then we'll go in and manually verify that was indeed the location. As I said, the process doesn't necessarily work great when there's an abrupt ending, and that tends to happen in the more severe crashes. So we've gone back and looked at all those as well, find some locations. But yeah, in cases where a particular project sees some of this, and we have to go back and verify that's usually the approach we follow. In many cases, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. So for some of the projects, what you end up doing is just maybe, I guess, over-selecting trips. So let's say you need, I don't know, 1,000 trips at a particular location to have a useful sample. Generally what we'll do is we'll oversample a little bit, maybe 1,100 or so, something in that range to kind of account for the ones that could potentially be misplaced.
Okay, thank you.
Susie has something to add.
Well, I just raised this as a question. Since location data can often provide pretty detailed and accurate information about the identity of participants, could you discuss how participant identity is protected both in the heat maps and in the map matching table?
Okay, I could turn that back to you, but sure. Yeah, in the heat maps, there's actually lower thresholds in terms of what will be displayed. So if you were able to do a comprehensive search on Insight as far as what the minimum number is, you would find what that number is. And I don't recall what it is, but you know, we only display traversals or links that have a minimum number of traversals and that were done by a minimum number of participants. As far as the map matching table, that's a good point. So the map matching table will take for any particular trip, it'll go all the way from the beginning of the trip and to the end of the trip, and so that's part of the reason the table can be made directly available, because it has the origin and the destination. That said, algorithmically within our compute resources, or if you want to have more direct access to the map matching table itself, what we can do is clip out or take out the origin and the destination links for that trip, and so that reduces the opportunity for disclosing the identity of the participant.
Looks like Ali was typing a question, but decided not to. So
We have the presentation is available here on the left side of your screen. Today's presentation for download. It's also a future STAC session on February 8th.
And Brett, we have one question. So is it possible to integrate RID and NDS for many trips in an automatic manner?
I think
it's already been done, right?
Fashion, this has already been done in terms of the trip summary file that Miguel and Zach both discussed. It has limited information, you know, in terms of, and Miguel, I don't remember now, I know you said speed, what number of lanes there too?
Class.
And, oh yeah, code, the HSIS code. But I mean, if there isn't a single coverage, for example, for the trips that happened on curves, or the trips that happens where you have a 4-foot paved shoulder, because the combinations, I mean, you have, if I'm not mistaken, 5 million trips. So to be able to provide all roadway attributes for those 5 million trips is an overkill, because, you know, we're probably not going to work with all of that. So what we tried to do between us and VTTI, and what TRB wanted and what Federal Highway wanted, is to produce that trip summary file and provide those minimal roadway characteristics for each trip. But then beyond that, it has to be done on a case-by-case basis based on the research question that you have. But the process is still automated, as you just, I mean, you're not doing this by hand, but you still have to follow the, you know, the GIS procedures to be able to do that. But I mean, it's not manually, it's more of having to follow a process to complete it, similar to the examples that Zach showed.
And the process seems would be easier if you get your own copy of the RID, you get a data use license to add the linking summary file to the RID, right? I mean, correct? that should help expedite the process.
Yeah, if you're a GIS person, you know, if you end up with, let's say, 1,000 links or 10,000 links from VTTI, it's a straightforward process to do the dynamic segmentation and get, you know, the whatever roadway attributes you're interested in, and vice versa. It's easy to find the link IDs with roadway characteristics that you're interested in, and then say to VTTI, you know, give me whatever many trips on these link IDs. So I think I mean, the process is automated in the sense you still need to find where your interest areas are, but in terms of linking the two and finding link IDs, that is done through the GIS, and you know, Zach and Skylar can do it in few minutes. If we really know what you want to, it might take a couple of hours for somebody who's just starting.
Thank you. And Brett, I think you were cut off before you were mentioning the upcoming webinar on February 8th, which will be the last webinar of the series.
Yeah, the last in the series of 4. It's on NDS and RID research and outreach opportunities. You need to go back in and sign up for it. The link is there on the lower left. We'll also send out an email to this group, but we need to just go back in and sign up for it as you did for this one. There's also recordings that will be available. We have a temporary link we can provide you now, but we are in the process of posting those on the STAC website. We just need to get them downloaded and then uploaded to the STAC website. So those should be up in the next few days.
Very good. And you could always contact the staff at STAC, Yusuf Muhammad Shah or myself, Charles Fay. And I don't think we provided you with the contact information today in the slide, but if you just do a simple web search of FHWA STAC, that'll bring you right to our webpage, and just go to the contact information. And we're basically here to answer any of your questions related to the NDS or RID. That goes for primarily the state DOTs. And as both Miguel and Omar had mentioned, they are actually under a contract with TRB to answer questions about their respective databases they put together. Okay. Not seeing any more questions, Brett. Omar and Miguel, you have anything to add?
No, nothing on our end.
And there are no questions in the phone queue.
I'm sorry about that.
Good, sounds good. Appreciate everybody's participation today, and go take a look and sign up for the February 8th session.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.